Sceptile, Incineroar, Blastoise. These are some of the most iconic and the most beloved starters across the entire Pokemon franchise. Starters are more often than not the Pokemon that are the strongest on our teams for a playthrough. And I'd also argue that starters are the most important Pokemon in every new region. But not all starters are created equally. And today, I'm going to be taking a look at the worst starter Pokemon from each region. Now, this selection won't strictly be based on battling prowess, but also things like importance to the franchise, anime appearances, and even basic things like design. Alright then, let's begin. In the Kanto region, it was a tough decision, seeing as these three are the original starter Pokemon. And let's face it, they're all incredibly iconic, but the worst starter from Kanto is Blastoise. Don't get me wrong, I like it, but Blastoise just feels like the most underwhelming of the Kanto starters. I mean, from a typing standpoint alone, it is the only monotype of the three. I also kind of find Blastoise's design to be a bit lackluster as well. Like, okay, he's just a big turtle, so what? That's nowhere near as cool as a massive fire-breathing dragon or even a giant grass dinosaur. So in the Kanto games, the Squirtle line performs pretty well, but definitely not as good as the Charmander or Bulbasaur lines. The only big battles that Squirtle actually has a major advantage in is against Brock and Blaine. And I guess it also does well in most of the battles against Giovanni, but unfortunately though, Blastoise isn't even the best water type to use in a Kanto playthrough. Then when we look at Blastoise in the metagame, it's always been solid. Not great, just solid. Blastoise certainly doesn't have that great of stats, and it really isn't as bulky as you'd like it to be. The worst thing for Blastoise is there really isn't anything that it can do super well. It was also pretty limited offensively for a very long time. Luckily though, it did get access to Shell Smash and Sword and Shield, and that finally gave Blastoise a much needed buff. And yes, since it is a Kanto starter, it of course received both a Mega Evolution and a Gigantamax to help it keep up with modern power creep. Now, Gigantamax Blastoise is alright at best, and while Mega Blastoise was kind of good, it was once again the most underwhelming of the Kanto starter Megas, while also having far and away the worst design of the bunch. I also can confidently say that Blastoise is the least popular of the Kanto starters. By now, I think we all know just how famous Charizard is, so there's really no competition here, but I also view the Bulbasaur line as a bit more popular than the Squirtle line, because Bulbasaur is literally the first Pokemon in the entire Dex, and in the anime, Ash Ketchum's Bulbasaur had a much more prominent role. While yes, Ash's Squirtle was very cool, it was given much less screen time and took part in way fewer battles than Bulbasaur. Yes, I know I did kind of drag Blastoise during this entry, but don't get me wrong. I honestly think it's a pretty good starter. It's just all the Kanto starters are amazing, and I guess Blastoise is just the least amazing. Everything about the Johto region was pretty underwhelming, especially when we look at the starters. But I think we can all agree that the worst starter from Johto is Meganium. Now, Meganium is widely regarded as the worst starter of all time. And while I think that might actually be a step too far, I have to agree that it is downright terrible. There really isn't all that much to like about Meganium, honestly, and pretty much everything about it is just bad. Seeing as Meganium is a pure grass type, and on its own, the grass typing is objectively very bad. So being mono grass automatically makes it horrendous in battle, as it is weak to 5 very common types. Its stats also don't help it out at all either. It's got alright defenses, but as I just said, seeing as it is a pure grass type, it's got a ton of weaknesses working against it. To be quite honest, a Meganium will never be useful on your team. There are just so many better options as far as grass types when team building. Then, in any version of the Johto games, the Chikorita line is awful and turns any playthrough of the games into a major challenge. It greatly struggles in the first 2 gyms against Faulkner and Bugsy, and it also matches up very poorly against the likes of Morty, Jasmine, Price, and Claire. And that's not even to mention the battle with Koga of the Elite Four and the champion battle with Lance. Now that's a huge amount of battles that Meganium will be at a disadvantage for during a common Johto playthrough. It doesn't actually become useful until after the Elite Four, where it does match up pretty well against the Kanto gym leaders. And then as far as other Pokemon media, Meganium hasn't gotten much love through those outlets either. There have been a few Meganiums pop up throughout the anime series over the years, and I really feel like it could have gotten a lot more notoriety had Ash Ketchum fully evolved his Bayleaf into a Meganium, but obviously that didn't happen. There just isn't much to like about Meganium. It's got a boring design, bad stats, and overall, it's forgettable. I don't think it's the worst starter ever, but I do believe it is quite awful. I view the Hoenn starters to be the best trio in the whole series, so naturally, this decision was very tough. But ultimately, I decided to go with Swampert as the worst starter from Hoenn. Obviously, Swampert is actually amazing in just about every aspect possible, and I'm gonna try to not make this entry mean, because Swampert is actually great. But I just picked him here because I can honestly say he's the least popular of the Hoenn starters. I think we all know how amazing Blaziken actually is, especially during its Mega Evolving Prime, and Sceptile might just be one of the few Pokemon to have zero real haters. But Swampert just doesn't seem to get the same love and attention that the other two get. Now, in battle, there are just so many good things that Swampert has going for it. First, it does have the highest base stat total of any starter Pokemon ever. Next, Swampert has a great typing in Water and Ground. That means it's only weak to the Grass type, which, as we know by now, really isn't all that good, especially offensively. Then from a competitive standpoint, Swampert has always been pretty good. But Swampert was at its best in battle back in Gen 6 and 7 when it had access to its Mega Evolution. And while yes, it is a bit goofy looking, Mega Swampert can pack quite a punch, and it will often move first in rain thanks to its Swift Swim ability. Meanwhile, I'm sure you know just how dominant Swampert can be in any of the Hoenn games. It should come as no surprise that the Mudkip line can easily solo any of the Hoenn playthroughs with relative ease. Swampert is actually the preferred Pokemon for speedrunners to use in the Gen 3 games. The only thing that really holds Swampert back is that the Pokemon Company themselves seem to not care for it all that much. They really don't ever give Swampert any time in the spotlight, and as a result of this, Swampert is obviously much less popular than the other two Hoenn starters. For example, I know it's just a spin-off game, but Swampert is suspiciously the only Hoenn starter to not make it into the Pokken DX game, while both Blaziken and Sceptile earn their spots on the roster. Meanwhile, in the advanced series of the anime, the writers didn't even waste their time having Brock evolve his Marshtomp into a Swampert, but of course Ash had his Sceptile and May her Blaziken. Swampert is still very solid, and it is definitely the best starter here on this list, but still, it is the worst starter from Hoenn. In the Sinnoh region, all the starters are great, and I'd argue that these three have the best design of any final stage starter trio. But I do believe that Torterra is the worst here from Sinnoh. This entry was tough, as I really did consider putting Empoleon here, but Empoleon edged Torterra thanks to its superior typing and better distributed stats. As for Torterra himself, let me start by saying I love its design. The World Turtle concept is so awesome, and it's pulled off quite well here with Torterra. Unfortunately though, that's kind of where the good ends for Torterra. The biggest things working against it are that terrible speed stat and the major weakness it has to the ice typing. In any of the Sinnoh games, the Turtwig line always seems to be just okay for a playthrough. It really thrives during the start of the games, as it has an advantage over Rourke, Crasher Wake, and then much later on against the Elite Four member Bertha. But it will greatly struggle against the likes of Fantina, Candace, Aaron, and Flint. Then as far as competitive battling, Torterra has been in or close to the bottom tier since its inception back in Generation 4. With the prominence of a move like Ice Beam almost always being found on a common water type, it's just too hard to successfully use Torterra in high-level battles. And then finally, let's take a look at Torterra's role in other Pokemon media. Well, Torterra did at least get a pretty awesome moment in the Detective Pikachu movie. And then meanwhile in the anime, Torterra ironically got vastly overshadowed by Ash's Infernape when it joined its team. His Infernape went on to have one of the most epic moments in anime history against Paul. And this happened in the very same battle that Torterra got utterly embarrassed. In the Unova region, we got what might just be the most hated trio in all of Pokemon. Now personally, I don't totally hate them, but yeah, they just really aren't that good. But of them all, Samurott is the worst of the worst. In all honesty, Samurott just seems pretty bland to me. And it's weird because Oshawott was alright, and Duat was actually a great middle stage, but it was just a very weird decision to have Samurott go onto all fours, but then still have it try to be a samurai. As far as battling, Samurott's stats are pretty weirdly distributed. It doesn't know if it wants to be a physical or a special attacker, but then it's also kind of slow, which obviously cripples it. In the Unova region alone, there are loads of water types that are just outright better than it. Seismitoad and Jellicent have much more versatility in battle, thanks in large part to them both being multi-typed Pokemon. And while none of the starters in Unova actually do all that great in the gyms or the Elite Four battles, Samurott actually performs the worst, as the only favorable matchup it has in either sets of the Unova games is gonna be against Gym Leader Clay. Samurott sees very little play and is far and away the worst Unova starter when it comes to competitive battling. We all know how powerful Superior can get thanks to its contrary Leaf Storm set. And then meanwhile, Emboar can actually hit quite hard and even be somewhat tanky. But Samurott can't do anything all that well, and that's one of its biggest problems. In closing, somehow in a bland bunch of starters, Samurott finds itself to be the blandest of the bland. In the Kalos region, we have 3 starters that are definitely not all treated equally. However, I would say the worst is Delphox. Delphox is honestly kinda just a weird Pokemon. Delphox's design is just kind of gross to look at, especially when we take a closer look into its ear hair. Next, it's obviously gonna be very hard for Delphox to thrive, thanks to Greninja. I mean, Greninja is easily one of the most iconic and beloved Pokemon of all time. It has also received an insane amount of special attention over the years, from Smash Bros. To alternate forms to being the star of the Kalos anime. So that really leaves the other 2 starters looking comparatively worse. And while the Chestnut line is kinda goofy too, it at least looks somewhat cool and pulls off its Knight gimmick a little better than Delphox pulls off its Witch gimmick. It also seems like the Pokemon Company prefers Braixen over Delphox, as it kind of gets shown off a bit more than its own final form. In the XY anime, Serena's Braixen remains in its second form for the entirety of that series. But at least Delphox is relatively good in battle. In the Kalos games, Delphox is definitely the second best Kalosian fire type, because it's just not gonna beat Talonflame. But again, it earns this spot as the worst Kalos starter thanks to its terrible design and always having to be compared to Greninja. The Alola region introduced some of the best starters we have ever seen. I love all 3 of these mons, and any of them can make for an awesome playthrough of the Alola games. However, I did have to pick one, and so the worst from Alola is Primarina. So this will be another entry where I really like the starter, but it got picked mostly due to popularity, similar to that Swampert entry. So it's quite obvious that Primarina got the short end of the stick from the Pokemon Company in just about every aspect ever. In the Sun and Moon anime, Ash Ketchum used both a Rowlet and an Incineroar on his final team, and they both had their fair share of awesome moments and amazing stories. And then the Popplio line was instead just used by Lana, who on her own is a cool character, but let's face it, she's not Ash. Then we also have representation in different games for the other 2 starters, with Decidueye earning a spot in the Pokken game, and then of course we also have Incineroar making it into Smash Ultimate. But then Primarina got nothing. I think what hurts Primarina the most when compared to these other 2 is how it kind of has a pretty feminine design. I know anyone can play Pokemon, but we do know that it's mostly played by boys, and more often than not, they will want to use the Owl Archer or Wrestling Kitty over the girly looking Siren. I do really like Popplio though, as it has a ton of charisma, but it definitely isn't the most marketable Pokemon, especially when compared to the marketing god himself, Rowlet. However, I can't deny that Primarina can be really good in battle. It will certainly carry you in any Alola playthrough, as it can help you in some way in just about every major battle. Primarina is even pretty solid in competitive too. Again, that typing is very tough to beat, and its signature Z-move is amazing too. Now, it's definitely not the best Alolan starter in competitive because, well, Incineroar's a thing, but I can confidently say Primarina is better in battle than Decidueye at least. So it's not like the Popplio line is bad, because it's actually quite good. It's just the least popular. Now it's time for Galar, and the collection of starters here are not really all that good, honestly. But obviously, the worst here is Inteleon. Inteleon is a starter that I just do not like one bit. And I know I'm certainly not alone here, as much of the Pokemon fandom also hates Inteleon. What really holds Inteleon back from, well, I guess being liked, is its design. While none of the Galar starters' designs are really even that good, Inteleon's is far and away the worst. Now, I really disliked the whole design gimmick these Galar starters had, but Inteleon being based on James Bond of all things is pretty idiotic. And honestly, the execution of it is just as horrendous. Its build is awkwardly slim, and it makes my stomach sick to look at. It really sucks because both Sobble and Drizzile had really solid designs, and even the potential to knock it out of the park with its final form. But obviously that didn't happen. In the Sword and Shield games themselves, the Sobble line struggles pretty badly in the early games, as the first gym leader Milo will have a major type advantage over it, and then it's also heavily resisted by Nessa's team. However, at least Inteleon performs pretty well against Leon, as it is 4 times effective against his Rhyperior, and then of course it also has the type advantage over Leon's Gigantamax Charizard. All in all, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that Inteleon might be the most hated starter Pokemon of all time, and it's almost entirely thanks to its ugly design. And now finally, we have the Paldea region, and the worst starter introduced in Gen 9 is Quaquavel. I just don't like Quaquavel. If you've followed this channel for a long time, then you probably already know that. I think Quaquavel sucks. I think it really ruined what could have been an epic line for Quaxly and Quaxwell. But man, once again, do I feel like Pokemon dropped the ball with a final form starter. To me, it's just a bit too boisterous and animated, and it's honestly a bit too distracting when used in battle. And while we can make fun of Quaquavel's design all day long, there is no denying it can actually be pretty impressive in battle. With access to Moxie and its signature attack Aqua Step, which raises its speed, Quaquavel is a Pokemon that is always poised to snowball through opposing teams. However, all in all, Quaquavel is still probably the worst Paldean starter in battle. Meowscarada has some incredible and amazing versatility thanks to its move pool and Protean. And then Skeledirge is the unaware wall that can also gain some major stat boosts thanks to its signature move Torch Song. But even in the Scarlet and Violet games, Quaxly and Quaxwell don't even have many favorable gym leader matchups. It's not until it fully evolves and gains the fighting type that it gains a type advantage over gym leader Grusha. And then finally, in the new Pokemon Horizons anime, both Sprigatito and the Fuecoco lines are much more prominent in the series, as they are the partner Pokemon of each main character respectively, whereas a Quaxly is owned by Dot, a minor character who really isn't even all that well liked. It seems like Quaquavel is just another starter Pokemon who had the ball dropped on its final form, but at least it is relatively good in battle. Well guys, that's that. Do you agree with my picks as to who the worst starter is from each region? Be sure to let me know in the comments section below. Thanks guys, and have a good one.